Welcome back to my channel, and if you're new here, welcome to the channel for the first time. Today we're going to talk about rib hump in scoliosis, what it is, why it happens, and what you can do about it. But before we do that, if you appreciate videos like this, then all I ask in return is for you to hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. And doing those things helps the channel out tremendously. And in return, if you have a question or a comment, put it in the comment section below and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Thank you so much. Now let's begin. Okay, what is a rib hump? Well, when the spine rotates, it pushes back some of the ribs and you end up with the characteristic scoliosis rib hump shown here. But why does this happen? The spine actually moves in 3 dimensions. That means it moves forwards and backwards, side to side, and it rotates both ways. So if this is someone from behind, okay, so these are the segments from behind. If the spine is bending to the side, which is common in a scoliosis, it will also rotate, and it does that because of the coupled motion of the spine. You can't have a side bending without a rotation. But interestingly, we can also say that the coupling motion is also attached to a third motion, which is going to be either extension, especially if you're younger, you get a flat back in the thorax, or flexion if you're older, and that means that gravity is basically getting the better of you and you end up with more of a kyphosis. So now we know that the rib hump is caused by the rotation of the spine. And let's have a look at how this works. The spine in this case will start rotating to the right. As it rotates to the right, it pulls those ribs back. And that causes a rib hump when you bend forward or when you're looking at someone from behind. But it also pushes the ribs on the left-hand side forward slightly. Now, this also happens in the lumbar spine, right? So the most common curve is a reverse S-curve like this. This is also going to happen down here. But because we don't have the ribs attached to the lower back, we don't get to see that rib hump as much. What we do notice, however, though, is that on the longer side of the curve, we get a thickening of this muscle. Well, that's actually a bit of a misnomer because it's not a thickening of the muscle. It really is where these little bones here, the transverse processes, are pushing back on the muscle. It looks like the muscle is thicker and stronger, but actually it's simply the bones just pushing back underneath, giving that illusion. What can we do about this rotation? That is the main question. Certain methods of scoliosis correction would have you breathe into this concavity here and try and open up the concavity from the inside using almost like a hydraulic method. That's a great approach. Other methods would have you moving your head to one side, and this is something that I do in the scoliosis correction protocol. And the moving the head to the side starts to correct the change in what we call the frontal plane. Now, as we now know, the spine is coupled in its motions. So if we move it this way, it will also derotate. Now, understanding that is important because if we just go after the derotation by using something like a foam roller, it's going to feel nice, but it's not actually going to change anything permanently. It's going to potentially stretch some muscles, stretch some joints, move the bones in space, but as you stand back up and gravity gets the better of you again, you're going to go back to where you just came from. So you actually have to use your muscles to change that. Now, how do we do that? Well, firstly, we can think about methods of pulling these ribs forwards, okay? And there's lots of different ways to do that. My favorite one is simply to take your arm and push it forward like this, but not having the motion just in your shoulder joint. You've got to have the motion go through your shoulder joint into your thorax. So if I turn this way, you can see this. Look at my thorax here. If I push my arm forward, nothing happens. But if I push my arm forward and rotate slightly, well, now I've got a change in my thorax. That's what you want because the change in the thorax is going to pull these ribs forwards. All right, we also need to change the frontal plane, that curvature, the most common curvature that we see in scoliosis, at the same time. Now I've got lots of videos on my YouTube that show you how to do that. For example, you could be sitting down like this, you take one hand up over your head whilst taking the other hand across in rotation. And that will start to correct the curve, and in this case it's a C curve, in both the frontal plane and the transverse plane, which is rotation. But then you can also add in flexion and extension to help in that third plane as well, in that third dimension. All right, so once we've got some rotation or derotation happening towards those ribs, we're pushing them forwards. Well, how do we hold it there? And that's the question. We've got to think about muscle strength, and we've got to think about which muscles can actually pull those ribs forward and they come across on the sling here. So if you think about this big chest muscle here, it actually has attachments to the abdominal muscles, namely the obliques going forward through here. So if I want to take this arm forward, tense this muscle, tense the obliques, it's actually going to pull these ribs forward, and it's going to potentially become stronger at pulling those ribs forward, and that's what we need. But conversely, this motion here, if you look at my chest is going this way, is the same as if I were to pull this arm backwards. Do you see my chest ends up in the same place? So I could take a band in this hand and simply pull backwards as well. So I've got a pushing motion that can do it, and I've got a pulling motion that can do it, but I also need a frontal plane motion that corrects it, and I need a sagittal forwards and backwards motion that will help mobilize and correct my spine. So once we put all those motions together, we start coming up with a plan on how to decrease the rib hump. But that is super applicable to a C-shaped curve, like this. But when you have an S-shaped curve, you have to be careful, because really you're dealing with two curves here, okay? So we don't want any of those motions that were happening for the derotation of the top curve happening in the lumbar spine, because it could make the lumbar spine worse. Now, in the scoliosis correction protocol, we deal with this by pre-positioning the lumbar spine in a way of correcting it. So we derotate it a little bit, we change it in the frontal plane a little bit, and then we use top-down movements to get into the upper curve only. But it's something to be careful of. Let's say you're just trying to do these exercises at home, you're following different exercises off YouTube, and you're piecing it all together to come up with a program for yourself. And that's great, that's commendable, but you have to be careful, because sometimes the stuff you do from the top, if you don't steady and pre-position the bottom, you can end up making one curve worse. Just a word of warning to you there. Okay, in summary, we know that the spine is now coupled in motion, or as my friend Gary Gray likes to say, trupled, which means when you have a side bending like this, you're also going to get a rotation, but you also get a change in either extension or flexion as well. And in order to correct that, we need to use all three motions, okay? So we need to use a correction in the frontal plane, a correction in the transverse plane, and a correction in the sagittal plane. Put those together and you stand a really good chance of decreasing your rib hump. All right, I'm gonna wrap this video up here. I hope you've enjoyed it, and let me know what you think down below in the comments. And if you try these exercises, let me know how you get on. As always, if you want my opinion on your specific case, send me an email or a friend request on Instagram or Facebook. My email is in the description below. Make sure you stay tuned for my next video, because that will be up shortly. But until then, have a great few days.